They did not, in Raleigh's words, he wanted evolutionary change and not revolutionary change.
Well, when I interviewed with Raleigh Rogers to see if I could keep my job, because it was going to be a state system, he asked me why I wanted to be a lawyer. And I told him why I wanted to be a lawyer and help people work things out without killing each other and hurting each other. And he just kind of shook his head, but he hired me. But he put me in juvenile court.
It was generally thought that women couldn't be trial lawyers, and there were very limited opportunities for people to do that. Generally, it was thought that women would do things like estates and wills, that kind of stuff, back office type of practice where they wouldn't have a lot of client contact.
People were interested in me. I had a strong background, but they were not interested in hiring a woman to litigate.
I wanted to be a litigator. And when I interviewed with the law firms that went out to Harvard to interview, and was just sort of adamant about my position that I wanted to litigate, I got the reception, wouldn't you rather do transactional work? Because, you know, one, there weren't very many female litigators anyway, and there certainly were no Latino litigators.
I was hired to teach criminal law and procedure and do a clinical program at the University of Utah Law School. But 2 weeks before school started, the dean called me up and said that there had been some meetings among the trustees and the faculty, and they felt it was unseemly for a woman to teach criminal law. And so they had reassigned me to teach wills, estates, and trusts, and estate and gift tax.
I mean, they were challenging. They wanted to see what, you know, this woman was made of, and they assumed I wasn't made of much. My way of dealing with that at the time, and you have to remember I was fairly young, was to be the toughest DA, the most difficult to deal with of any of the DAs in county court. And I think I had that reputation.
But I think also I was a very aggressive defense attorney, very aggressive, proud of that.
And then when I went on the bench, the same thing happened. So you bet, lots of times over the course of the years when I have walked into a situation or a room knowing that certainly not all the people in the room or in the setting wished me the best.
Attorneys were not very happy about having a young woman on the bench. And I remember one old attorney shaking his finger at me. He didn't like my ruling, and he said to me, "Now you listen to me, young lady."
I suppose the thing that made me wonder the most my first 2 years about what I had done was getting on the Armed Services Committee and having that chairman insist that Ron Dellums and I share a chair for 2 years because he thought a black and a woman were not worth a whole chair.
There were no women who'd ever been an elected district attorney, an elected attorney general, no women in the U.S. Senate, very few women in any positions in the judicial system. Just most of the appointed or elected governmental officials were never women. So you look around now and you can see how much things have changed.
I didn't think that I was treated differently. And I tried most of my cases in federal court for my first 10 years. And I mean, that was a fairly hard environment, but it was a hard environment for everyone.
I have heard other people say differently. But by the time that I was a practicing attorney in the public defender's office, there had been several women before me, and they were outstanding attorneys. So there was already this benchmark, and you know, I was trying to attain that.
Most of the women I know have this idea in their head that they have to be super prepared. We're probably a little compulsive in that regard, I suspect.
So rather than confronting the discrimination or the expectation that this was a man's world, I think what a lot of us did was just try to meet that expectation with superior performance and to dispel the notion by pulling the legs out from under it rather than by confronting it face to face. And that may or may not have been the right thing to do, because it was essentially non-confrontational, and it allowed some of the premises to continue to exist.
I do run into the Old Boys Network, particularly in my area. So often deals get done on the golf course, on the ski slopes, after hours, over drink. And it is awkward as a woman. I can't really invite my client for a drink afterwards. It's hard for me to go ahead and be part of the gang out on the golf course. And so that part's been tough. I mean, I've had to approach that from a lot of different ways.
I guess my real approach was just to try to show people that I could be as good or better a judge as any man that was sitting on the court, and work harder. And sometimes women have to work harder. Back in those days, women did have to work harder.
Specifically, I was representing a client, a good client for our firm. All clients are good, but this was a long-standing client and a repeat client in front of District Court Judge in Denver, Ed Burns, who was, if I may use the word lightly, infamous. And he treated me very badly, very badly.
And I think that I was not alone in feeling alone as a woman in, being surrounded by, in my case, deputy district attorneys and assistant U.S. attorneys. Women and all over, were isolated in their particular positions.
His behavior, and some of the other judges that I appeared in front of, but I wouldn't say all of them, but some of them, encouraged me to get on the phone and start calling people like Judge Sandy Rothenberg and many other women that were practicing at the time, and I said, we need to get together.
We finally decided that we would name it the Colorado Women's Bar Association.
We were part of the group that formed the Women's Bar, and there were, I guess, about 50 women who formed the Women's Bar. We were the first officers, and I always say, we were the first captains of the Titanic.
We were, in the early days, we were a gang of thugs. We had a good time. We had a good time.
One was to promote women in the judiciary, another was to support women in law school, training and education for women lawyers, also to support women's legal issues in the community or within the state.
After all, we were very privileged, even in our disparate, our lack of equality with the men in the profession. We were very privileged by the standards of most women. And we are highly educated, most of us fairly articulate, and I wanted us to play a role in that, representing women.
The first reaction was pretty negative among a lot of people. And it also among a lot of women lawyers who made sure they kept an arm's length distance from the women's bar because they didn't want to get branded as one of those women.
There were many women, there were many women who were very concerned as to how we would be perceived by the men in the profession. Heaven forbid that we would be perceived as whining or complaining.
The primary goal, I think in my mind, was that we would represent a powerful organization within the state bar.
And, there weren't very many of us, and most of us were either in the public sector or had small practices. And so we were not, on the face of it all, very much of a threat. But was like throwing a stone into a lake, and the ripple effect just went across the water.
Yes, anything like that was going on, I was part of it. I was on the board of the Women's Bar early on, yes.
That's important because sometimes it can be so lonely. As a sole practitioner, you know, you're in your office, you're taking care of business, and then as a single mom, you're taking care of the child. So it's not like I was at every meeting of the Women's Bar Association or the Sam Carey Bar Association, the African American Bar. But those were organizations that I knew that I could turn to.
We were a bit amazed at what was happening because we had this convention and invited all of the political candidates to the convention, and they came.
That because we were beginning to be very active in terms of when judgeships would go up, we would make appointments. We would make every effort to get a woman on the three panel, and I think it shows today.
Several women's groups came to Susie and myself and said, we've decided that you and Zita are the two people that have the best chance to get to the federal bench. So we're going to push both of you.
Women began to see that they could apply for judgeships and get them.
I have 4 brothers. I don't have any sisters. So I always said when I was appointed to the court and I was the only woman with 6 men on the justices as my colleagues, that it really wasn't all that different from growing up in a household where I was one with 4 brothers, and at least these guys weren't going to call me fat and ugly and things like that.
You know, I told you when I came to Pueblo I was the one and only lawyer here. We've just formed a chapter of the Colorado Women's Bar, and there are roughly 30 women lawyers now.
But, you know, there's tremendous change. I mean, just these stories I'm telling you about, you know, women in the courtroom back, you know, almost 30 years ago versus now. Huge difference. We have made a difference.
Those connections and how we all support each other and promote each other in the profession is one of the most important parts of my legal career.
Whenever I would go to a meeting or go to the retreats or the conventions, it would be a time where I would share laughter and tears, and it would just be absolutely wonderful. So it's an organization that provided an opportunity for me to know that I was okay.
Well, one of the things the Women's Bar did was, you know, provide that affirmation. I mean, one of the ways we did it early was all this bawdy humor. You know, tap dancing group, you know, would just say outrageous things. You know?
Someone said, hey, do you want to be in this show? And I was like, sure, sounds like fun. And they're like, well, you're going to have to take tap dance lessons.
No kidding, we took tap dance lessons. I mean, lawyers have to be prepared.
Thus was the birth of the Untimely Motions.
There was an organization called Law Club that would prepare a show every year for the bar convention, but at that time they excluded women.
The Law Club didn't have any women members, but interestingly enough, the wives of the men who were members could be in the show. But women attorneys could not be in the show.
So, undaunted, they just started their own organization, and it became the Untimely Motions.
We really got outrageous that the show became much more off-color, much more outrageous than the Law Club show ever was. And by today's standards, probably would not be politically correct.
And it was great fun. So just the idea of women lawyers in fishnets in and of itself and tap shoes is pretty over the top.
One of the things that we really got known for was our kick line dance to Everything's Coming Up Roses.
Being successful in overturning that case is the kind of reward that not many lawyers ever get to be involved in. Just going through a case, starting with the complaint, and that was one of the few district court cases that I've been involved in. I did basically the legal strategy and the briefing for that all through the very long trial, and then handled it on 2 trips through the Colorado Supreme Court and through the U.S. Supreme Court. We got a fairly remarkable result in that. It was the first time the U.S. Supreme Court basically